Tere tulemast tagasi! Tervisedenduse konverents 2021 tervitab teid taas ja loodetavasti on energiapaus teile hästi mõjunud, sest aeg on paralleelsessioonide jaoks. Teie olete oma ekraanidega tulnud siis täpselt nii palju kaugele, et olete vaatamas 3. sessiooni ja 3. sessioon kannab pealkirja erivajadus ja seksuaalsus, otse ja ausalt. Ma arvan, et umbes 20 aasta jooksul oleme jõudnud peaaegu sinna paika, kus rääkides ühes lauses inimesest ja seksuaalsusest on täiesti normaalne. Jah, me ei tee seda võib-olla igas kohas, aga siiski inimeste jaoks ei ole enam seksuaalsusest rääkimine väga suur probleem. Kui me selles lauses teeme ühe väikese muudatuse ja lisame sinna erivajadusega inimene ja seksuaalsus, siis tundub, et asjad liiguvad hoopis kardinaalselt teises suunas. Eestis sisuliselt võib öelda, et ei ole väga palju artikleid, ei ole sellest räägitud, aga teisalt see olukord on meil siinsamas ju olemas. Mured on, seksuaalsus on, inimesed on, aga huvitav, miks on nii, et me sellest ei räägi ja miks on nii, et abivajajad võib-olla alati seda abi ei saa. Me räägime tänases ettekandes ja tänases sessioonis siis täpsemalt kindlasti tabudest. Miks see nii on, et tegelikult erivajadustega inimeste seksuaaltervisest ja seksuaalsusest väga palju ei räägita? Räägime ka sellest, kuidas tegelikult hariduses võiks välja näha just nende inimeste harimine või siis info jagamine. Kas see on erinev kui tavalistele inimestele ja kui on, siis mismoodi? Ja sessiooni lõpetame tegelikult olukorraga Eestist. Me räägime sellest, missugune olukord on Eesti hooldekodudes ja kuidas see kõik näiteks läbi koolitaja pilgu võiks välja näha. Aga liigume siit esimese ettekande juurde, mille pealkiri on puue ja seksuaalsus, kas viimane tabu. Ja Norrast on meil siis läbi teleühenduse või siis veebiühenduse saadaval Ingrid Tuunem, kes on õppejõud ei kuskil mujal kui Oslo Metropolitani ülikoolis ja tema siis seal terviseteaduste teaduskonnas õppejõu rolli kandmas on. Nii et sõna hetkel Ingridile läheb ja nautige tema etteastet.
Thank you so much, Jonas. I think my presentation is coming up on the screen now. Yes, there it is. So we can just start with going to the next slide. Yeah, so hello. Thank you so much for having me here. My name is Ingrid Tunem and I'm a Norwegian activist and researcher in sexuality and disability. Currently, I'm working at the Oslo Metropolitan University to develop a master course in disability and sexuality, as well as I'm in the starting of my PhD project about sexuality and people with disabilities acquiring assistance. My master thesis I wrote about sexual abuse on disabled people and how you were able to get help after experiencing it. So I have quite a diverse background in this field and I'm happy to speak to you today. Next slide, please. In this lecture today, I will speak to you about some of the reasons why sexuality and disability are still considered a taboo and what we as professionals can do to reduce this. And I will use both practical and theoretical framework to give advice on how to better engage with this topic in our everyday work. I will also briefly discuss intersectionality and why an intersectional approach to sexuality and disability is necessary. Next slide, please. So sexuality and disability is a topic that is not often addressed either in media, films, series, or in the society or in our health professions. So why don't we talk about sex and disability? I think this is a complex issue, but one of the main reasons is how we approach disability. Traditionally, disability has been understood as a medical problem. The medical model convinces us that a disabled body is wrong and it needs to be fixed. A disabled body breaks the norm and the stereotypes, but it's not wrong. It does not need to be fixed. So we need to end the medical stigma of disability, because then we can go away from considering disabled bodies to be asexual and undesired, because the truth is that people with disabilities are first and foremost people, as everyone else. So with switching your perspective from a medical model and a medical view of disability and starting to acknowledge people with disabilities as human first and have a human rights perspective, then it will be easier to work with sexuality, because everyone is human and everyone have a sexuality, and the disability is just a part of you, and it's a part of how your body works differently. And this is happening more and more worldwide, especially after the UN Conventions for the Rights with People with Disabilities. That it was a paradigm shift. We are now talking more about rights and discrimination rather than health and illness. Especially in Article 23 and 25 covers the right of having a family, getting married, have personal relations, and the right of health care regarding sexual and reproductive health. But if you read the convention and have the more wider World Health Organization definition of sexuality, you will see that sexuality is a part of many of the other articles as well. And the issue with sexuality and disability, especially in the healthcare services, is that it's been neglected for so long. And many healthcare workers feel that it's a taboo. They don't really want to talk about it. And often it's perceived that to talk about sex or sexuality with someone with a disability, you need to be an expert. You need to be a sexologist. But the truth is that you just need to be someone good to talk to. In a survey we did in Norway, most youth with disabilities had the same questions about sexuality as their peers. Only what they needed was someone to ask them, do you want to speak about sexuality, or give them the opportunity to raise their needs. And it's not considered, like, sexuality and disability should not consider a special field, because it's just part of our sexuality work. We need to, when we speak about sexuality, widen our perspective and be more creative, as I will show example of later today. Both youths, parents, and researchers unanimously agree that sexuality and disability field needs to be more positive and diverse attention. Healthcare workers need to break their own taboos and start talking about sex, sexuality, and sexual health with all patients, and especially those of us that have a disability or a chronic illness. Next slide. And intersectionality is important when we talk about sex and disability, because none of us are one identity alone. And intersectionality is about how all our identities get affected in the basic of intersections and how they affect each other. And they can reinforce each other and offer double stigma, or they can give you an easier life. For example, a lesbian disabled woman might meet other types of barriers and discrimination than a straight disabled white man. So intersectionality is important in regards of sexuality and disability, both to be open that different people have different struggles, but also to know that people with disabilities can be diverse in sexuality, attraction, gender identity, and their sexual preferences. So people with disabilities are not a homogeneous group, so our practical approach cannot be one size fits all. For example, in a conversation, we have to keep an open language and not just assume that someone's partner is the opposite sex before you know. Intersectionality is just about letting people be more than one box and allowing people with disabilities to be diverse human beings with multiple sides. So it's just simple. Even though it's a difficult concept, it's simple in our practical approach. Next slide, please. So often when we talk about sex and disability, we talk about sexual abuse. And we cannot, because about the people with disabilities are about 2 to 3 times as likely to experience and suffering sexual abuse and violence. And these reasons are complex, but an example would be lack of education. Many people with disabilities don't know what a sexual abuse is and how to stop it. Both in schools and healthcare, it's a topic that is often neglected. And in my master's degree, I interviewed 10 people with disabilities that had experienced sexual abuse, and none of them felt that they owned their own body, because their whole life, doctors, nurses, parents, caregivers had taken control over their bodies. Many have experienced to be naked in a room full of doctors without being able to raise their voice and say, know or own their own bodies. So when the sexual abuse happened, they felt that they could not stop it, because how could they when their body was everyone else? And also in school, if they learned about sexual abuse, they just decided that, but it doesn't consider me, because I know that there are different rules for my body. I already have other grown-ups touching my private parts, which is the usual how you tell children, no grown-ups should touch your private parts. But when you have a disability, you think there are different rules for you. So it's a higher risk for these reasons, and also because many people with disabilities live in institutions, are suffering from discrimination and segregation. Therefore it's important that the help they get is better. In Norway, the 10 people I interviewed, none of them felt that they got the help they needed. And teaching about sexual abuse in school has both a preventive effect and increases the likelihood for disclosure. But when we talk about sexual abuse, we also have to tell disabled people that you are at a higher risk. And the abuse might look different or feel different because your body feels different, but you still own your own body and you're still allowed to say no. And many struggle with acknowledging that they actually have experienced sexual abuse in the first place. One young woman told me that she thought she just had to accept it, because since she has a disability, she shouldn't have anything to say. And that's very powerful. Unfortunately, we talk too much about sexual abuse, and then we neglect to talk about the positive sexuality and disability, which is also important to remember. We should talk about sexuality and disability in a diverse way when we address the topic. Not only abuse, but also the positive sexuality and how people with disabilities can be able to explore their own body and their sexual possibilities. So now I will talk more about the possibilities for positive sexuality in a disabled body. Next slide, please. This slide, it's a lot of pictures for you, but I believe you cannot talk only indirectly about sexuality and disability. You need to be specific. While working with youths with disability, I was often asked detailed questions about how they could engage in sexual activities or what was possible for them to do. For example, how could I masturbate when I have a limited hand function? Sexuality and disability, for me, is not about sexology or experts, but it's about accessibility and adaptations. And I think this is key here. It's not sexual problems, but people with disabilities might need other aids or adaptations to be able to explore their sexuality. And most people with disabilities don't have sexual problems. They need information and someone who will listen to them. So in the picture, you can see different sex toys. There are many of them that can be adapted, and many are already adapted, for example, with hand controls, smartphones, and they can also be programmed to be controlled with eye controls for a computer. So my first advice when working with youths with a disability is to encourage them to start exploring their own body first before exploring with a partner. Sexual activities and orgasm might trigger spasms, or they can release them. And for some, sex is the best pain medicine there is. So with a disabled body, there are still endless of possibilities if you are creative. For example, a sling for lifting can be used as an aid for better positioning of the body together with a partner. The same can be done with pillows or beds that can be lifted, as you can see in the pictures here. And almost all disability aids can be used in a creative way with the partner. For many of the youths I talked to, exploring and finding new ways to use their bodies while having sex was something they found very fun, and they adapted their own aids or used utensils that could be found around in the house. And for some, it's not really about penetration or sexual intercourse, but exploring different senses of the skin. For example, playing with the earlobes, or using, as you can see in the picture, I have different utensils from the house. For example, you can use ice cubes or water to have different sensations. And it's really about the intimacy with the partner, not really about being able to do penetrative sex. For many, it's still about being able to be close to someone. And next slide, please. So this was the practical approach to the sexuality, but then to get the young people in a mindset where they could start exploring. We also did a lot of work here in Norway to raise the issue about sexuality and disability, both politically and also giving young people with disabilities safe arenas to learn about it, to get educated about sexuality. And it's important when implementing projects or guidelines to better serve people with disabilities in regards of sexuality. It's important that you listen to people with disabilities themselves. Nothing about us without us. To have a successful project, ownership is important. It must be designed to cater the actual needs of people with disabilities. So we did a lot of projects with young people in Norway, where we first did towards healthcare workers. We had training seminars for healthcare workers, and the Norwegian Association of Disabled Youth has also developed an online learning platform for professionals to both learn about the subject and get tips on how to talk about sexuality in their everyday practice. The main focus has been to be open and to make it clear to the young people that you are someone they can talk to. For the young people, we had member-based activities for the 13 to 35 age group with diverse disabilities, from cerebral palsy, amputation to spinal bifida and muscular dystrophy. The events were open for all, and our most popular events were our weekend seminar, which for many was a safe space away from home where they felt safe to discuss issues, hopes, and dreams. Both in the weekend seminars and in the other gatherings, the program was diverse. For example, we made Tinder profile and discussed if it's smart to be open about your disability online. And an important experience is that it's easier to talk about difficult topics if you're all. So, for example, we had movie nights and creative workshops, as well as dress-up nights to play with gender expression and style. We had political discussion and supports group, and one of our most popular activities was condom training for people with poor hand function, where they could train for as long as they want with guidance of a professional. The main goal of all our different activities was to show that sexuality and disability are two topics that belongs together. And for young people with disabilities, learning and gaining ownership of their own sexuality and their own bodies is fundamental to ensure a good quality of life. Sexuality and disability needs to be addressed and well known in both disabled people's life, in healthcare professions, schools, and society, because love is love regardless of ability. Next slide. And thank you so much for the opportunity to speak to you.
All right, thank you, Ingrid. Thank you so much for the presentation. We have some questions that we can go through. So basically, as we heard now, Norway seems to be quite, ahead of Estonia regarding the topic disabled people and sexuality. What are the key factors, in your opinion? Why is Norway in a state that you are right now, that you already talk about disabled people and their special needs or specialities regarding sexuality, for example, LGBTI and topics like that?
I think thank you, Jonas. I think the main reason is because the organization, the NGOs, has really been pushing. We have many activists that are working very hard to get this topic on the agenda, with media, with a lot of traction and a lot of speech. And then also we have started becoming, in like myself, that's an academic approach as well. And when we combine activism and academic, I think we can really have the needs being heard, because to know that sexuality is important, you have to hear it also from people with disabilities themselves, I think. And this is a good start, and I'm sure that Estonia will start working with in the same. And it's only 4 years since we really started working with this in Norway, and everything happens fast when you just use your resources, and we are many people that work in the topic.
In terms of people who are working in the medical sectors, doctors, nurses, when we look at the topic, disabled people and sexuality, is it more or less their own interest from the experts to know more about these topics, or is it more something that is already in their curriculum and it's something that you have to know when you're a doctor, for example?
I actually teach in the nurses' education, and they have 90 minutes about sexuality, and that's the only thing they learn about sexuality for 3 years. So it's not really much. So it has to be a personal interest for you to be good at it, because you won't be good at the 90 minutes where you are supposed to learn everything about sexuality from you're a child until you are old. So it's not enough. But we are starting to hear more and more about it in the education. And I know that also doctors themselves want to learn more about sexuality, and also sexuality and disability as well.
All right. Thank you so much for the presentation. Thank you for answering the questions. And now we're going forward with the other people that we have on lists. Ja nüüd me saame minna ka eesti keele peale kenasti üle. Nagu te nägite ka, siis Ingridi viimase slaidi peal oli täitsa kirjas ka tema kontakt. Kui soovite lisaküsimusi küsida, siis see võimalus on. Ja tuli ka sisse vahepeal küsimus selle kohta, et ei saanud hästi valida seda sessiooni ja seda vaadata. Ärge muretsege, kõik sessioonid suures osas on pärast võimalik järele vaadata. Järgmisena hakkame rääkima haridusest ja sellest tuleb siis rääkima Rachel Baker, kes siis täpsemalt on oma pealkirja loonud sellise erivajadusega õppijast lähtuva õppekava loomine. Tema on siis Seksuaalhariduse Foorumi ja seksuaalhariduse siis õpetaja ja Ühendkuningriikidest tema tuleb. Enne kui sõna talle anname, siis kindlasti need, kes on eelregistreerinud meie üritusele ja meie konverentsile, siis olge head, kasutage workshopi ja küsige julgelt küsimusi, mille me saame siis pärast esineja ettekannet ette võtta. Aga nüüd sõna juba Racheli käes on.
Hello everyone, I'm absolutely delighted to have been invited to speak to you today. My name's Rachel Baker and I'm the Senior Relationships and Sex Education Specialist at Sex Education Forum. We're an independent charity based in England, and for over 30 years we've been at the forefront of sex education. We work with the government, we work with the Department for Education, with local authorities, with schools and colleges, and directly with teachers. It's wonderful to be here to be able to share some of my experiences and expertise with you all. I'm a teacher, I'm a special educational needs specialist, and a sex and relationships trainer. My career has taken me through mainstream schools as a department lead for personal, social, and health education, into alternate provision settings for learners who are marginalised from education for all sorts of reasons, often because of emotional, social and mental health needs or perhaps behavioural difficulties, then to working with learners with moderate learning disabilities and as a nurture-based tutor. So I've been with Sex Education Forum now for a little over 2 years, but I still go into schools independently to carry out work directly with learners with disabilities as well. Today, I hope to be able to share with you some ways to create a meaningful curriculum for our learners with additional needs by decoding the often very complex topics in the relationships and sex education guidance and creating developmental learning ladders so that all learners can access the learning at the right level for them, for their age and their cognition and capability. I am conscious that we will have different acronyms and abbreviations over here, so I hope this little guide will help, and I will try to avoid any jargon. I also thought it would be helpful to show the structure of our education system in England and how our RSE curriculum builds through the years. We have statutory relationships education in primary with a non-statutory element of sex education, which is recommended. That happens during Key Stage 2. Then, as learners move upwards into our secondary system in Key Stage 3, relationships and sex education combined are statutory. In post-16, we then have what we call the preparation for adulthood outcomes, which includes a lot of the relationships and sex content. I work with teachers in schools all the time, and these are very frequently heard voices. Sometimes it is the concern that the learners just aren't ready for the content. Or it might be that the teachers just really don't know where to start. It can be some very worried voices sometimes that the learners aren't ready to tackle some of the complex themes. that's fair enough. This is real. Our guidance tells us what learners should know, but it doesn't really break down these topics into incremental steps. And if you are working with learners with highly complex needs and you have a very tricky topic, such as pornography or something like that, the learning objectives might feel a very long way away from your learner's grasp. So we need to know where to begin. We need to know how to find out where our learners are and how to decode these highly complex topics into more manageable bites. I like a ladder to illustrate this method. I think it's positive to remind us that wherever we are, we have achieved something already to get to this step, and that the next step might be just a little bit within our reach. If we keep climbing steadily and at our own pace, we will get closer to the top. So the way to do this would be to be learner-led, to take the lead from your learners' questions, from their interests, their responses, but also ensuring that we're age appropriate at all times. I think often people use the phrase age appropriate to mean not teaching the really grown-up stuff to the children when they're too young. But it also has another meaning, a flip side of that, which is about making sure that we are covering the adult content with the older learners, regardless of their cognitive ability. Ultimately, if you are the owner of a 17-year-old penis or a 17-year-old vulva, you need to know how it works. But that, of course, is when the differentiation comes in. And if our learners have a very low ability, the challenge then becomes to create very simplified and practical ways to explain quite complex themes, affording the young person the dignity to educate them at their chronological age, but to do so in an accessible way. And, of course, guided by assessment. That doesn't mean written tests, of course, but by questioning, by observation, and creative ways to ascertain a learner's starting point so that you can then build up gently from there. So here's a good little list of some things you could get started with, and all of these can be broken up in this same kind of way. These aren't in a particular order, it's more a pick list for you to select from. So, for instance, something like consent, especially consent to sex, might feel like a very, very distant learning objective for your learners, but perhaps starting with a simpler version of consent giving, which might be to do with being given a choice and specifying your preference, or even just simply being asked and having the right to say no, is a really good place to start, which you can then develop from. So we might find ourselves having conversations such as, would you like to play football outside today? And the learner might respond with, well, I would like to play, but I'd prefer to play something inside. It's so simple, but that's a really brilliant piece of consent discussion and negotiation. And we can practice this every day. And it forms a really good foundation to then later on being able to have those tricky conversations about sex in relationships and about consent. And talking about touch, this is a lovely activity that can be done with all ages, ranging from tiny little children all the way to adults. I've found this has had a really positive effect, and people get a lot from this exercise. So the idea of this is that we're talking about the different cats, the images that we see, talking about which cats might want us to stroke them or touch them today and which cats might not. So take a look at those pictures. Is there a cat on there that you think really doesn't want us to touch them today? Well, I think we can all say that number 2 and number 9 do not look like they want our attention today, do they? But are there any other cats on there that are telling us, no, not at the moment? Actually, number 3 is asleep, so definitely doesn't want our touch at the moment. And then number 1, who is feeding her babies, really enjoying a touch, but it's private and we're not invited to join that. But then are there any cats on this page who definitely do want us to stroke them? Learners might say number 4 perhaps, or number 6, but we really can't be sure, can we? And we need to encourage the conversation that we have to ask. And then if the person says no, or the cat says no, then we respect that and we don't carry on with the touch when the other person has expressed that they don't want that. So then we can think about how we transfer that learning, this very simple activity with friendly cats and sleeping cats, onto how it would be in an example with people. How would we know if a person wanted to touch? How could we express whether we do or we don't want to touch? And what should we do if someone touches us when we don't want them to? So I have an example here for you of a very simplified version of how I might build up a topic like masturbation, starting with a very simple statement about our own body parts and which are public and which are private. We need to make sure that our young people understand that they are allowed to touch their own body parts, but there are rules about it. You can then build up from then to discuss about touching our body, that it's not just about washing and going to the toilet, but we are allowed to touch our own bodies in a way that we just want to, because it's our body, as long as we're following the rules and it's in private. And then you can build up to include more complex terms such as genitals, and then also such as sexual pleasure. Masturbation and genital touch in general is a significant issue both in schools and at home, and we really owe it to our most vulnerable learners to ensure that we make this learning accessible to them. And a really frank approach to talking about genital touch is critical, and a consistent line between home and school is paramount to ensuring that the learner understands. With some learners with very significant and complex needs, it might feel like a very long, slow climb up that ladder. You might feel like you never get beyond step one, but that is okay if you're working at the appropriate level for that learner. The key is just to pare back the layers and to find that really critical kernel of the topic, the golden nugget that you absolutely have to start with, and to build up very, very gently from there. In the first instance, it might be that a commentary is the starting point, in which case this might be happening not in the classroom, but in a personal care environment. So asking the care staff to use the correct terms and to commentate their actions is hugely helpful. So the learner themselves may not ever actually use the word penis or use the word vulva, but that word will belong in that private space as part of that private activity and will then become familiar. So you might use a statement such as, I'm going to wash your vulva because I'm helping you to change your pad. Some centres use mirrors, either alongside the changing couch or even on the ceiling, to support people with PMLD to see what's happening and what their body looks like when these private activities are taking place. You can then develop upwards into yes-no questions and support young people to give consent or refuse consent by regularly practising the process of making choices. This doesn't need to be about sex or even about bodies, but a question like, would you like an apple? No. Would you prefer a pear? Is so much more inclusive than, here is your apple. Likewise, with something like taking off a learner's jumper on a hot day, we need to ask and give options. And ultimately, even if a young person refused to have their jumper taken off on a hot day, what's the worst that can happen for the few minutes before we then perhaps go back and ask again? It's really important that we afford the young person the dignity to have that choice over their body. And provided the young person is not going to get dangerously hot, if they say, no, I don't want my clothes taken off at the moment, then we need to respect that. Bloom's taxonomy for higher order thinking is such a valuable model to use in our assessment of relationships and sex education, and it really shows how our learners can make progress by climbing upwards through the tiers, starting with knowledge recall and simple explanations using the word because, climbing upwards through applying that learning in their analysis of scenarios, up to evaluating and synthesising responses. I have an example here of how you can use Bloom's and a lovely pitch book. So the story that I've used here is Julian is a Mermaid. It's the most beautiful pitch book, certainly one to have on your library shelf. So you can use this model to support your differentiated questioning and could use the same activity with a range of abilities, but tailor the questioning to suit your cohort. To give you a bit of the plot, Julian meets some mermaids on the train home from the swimming pool. He daydreams about being a mermaid, and when he gets home, he dresses up as a mermaid. His nana then sees him and he was worried that he's in trouble, but actually she gives him some beads and shows him that she accepts him, and they go to the carnival together. But you can use this simple storyline to question at quite different levels, ranging from asking for a factual recall, tell me about the story or what happened to Julian, all the way up to the more kind of creative next steps type question, how did Nana's response make Julian feel, or the kind of what might happen next story. I've included here some top tips for how to make your RSE provision inclusive to your learners with SEND. I think the main thing more than anything is that we need to be guided by assessment. We need to start where our learners are and never assume that they know more than we might expect, that they, more than another learner in the same class. We need to be using our assessment so that we can then plan responsively. And so that every learner is receiving a personalised curriculum, taking them on the next steps and really listening to our learners and being led by them in the position that they are when we receive them. Our learning environment too can make a massive difference on how accessible the teaching is to our young people. We need to create a safe and familiar learning environment so that the learners feel prepared, they feel ready when they arrive in the room and they know what's about to happen. Our teaching techniques need to be really varied, but also really practical, with lots of engaging activities that don't require lots of writing, so that instead we're assessing skills. And it's really important, I think, that we are assessing the demonstration of skills more than whether or not somebody can remember some facts. Yes, the facts are important, but the negotiation skills and the practical stuff is what they will use in their adult life. We do need to address misunderstandings. We do need to address negative attitudes. And we need to support a culture from home and school of a consistent positive attitude about talking about sex, about talking about the body. We need to take these huge topics and break them down into nice bite-sized chunks so that our learners can take one step at a time. Our content needs to be rights-based. It needs to be evidence-based. It can be really tricky as well, though, to detach everybody, us and our learner, from our personal beliefs and our personal experiences. So things like distancing techniques, characters, are really helpful to support us to explore themes without feeling personally vulnerable. And we need to be framing all of this learning as skills for independent, healthy and happy adulthood. It's been a pleasure to speak to you today. I hope that you found my contribution helpful to support you in RSE in your setting. If you'd like to access some further training, please do visit our website and have a look at our upcoming training calendar. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Rachel. I'm happy to welcome you now live as well. And let's go on with the questions. The first questions or question would be, you were talking about the decoding, and quite a lot of people like to, let's say, code some things. So they would like to stop using the names penis or vulva, and they're actually using some kind of other words. And they're, in a way, coding the words, so they don't want to say the real words. Is it something that we should do, or is it something that we shouldn't do?
That's a really interesting question, and one that I'm asked a lot of times. I think the really important thing for us to remember is that the correct terminology is so empowering. For a person to be able to accurately talk about their bodies is a really powerful thing. And if we feel uneasy about the correct term, such as vulva or penis, I think we as teachers need to own that and address that, because there's so many benefits in terms of safeguarding and independence by having the correct terms. Just thinking of safeguarding, if you don't know the correct term, you might not understand whether a young person is talking about a touch that happened on the outside of their body, the vulva, or the inside of their body, inside the vagina. And that does make quite a significant difference in terms of what might have happened. Somebody might bump your vulva playing football by accident. It's a very different thing if somebody touched you inside your vagina. And it's really important that young people have the vocabulary to talk about their experiences. So yes, definitely correct terms. And if the young person does need a family term as well, have it alongside, not instead.
So sometimes it's easier for people, let's say teachers or doctors, to not only know about the things that they should do when they, for example, are meeting or are in contact with a person with a mental disability, but maybe you can just share us, for example, 2 or 3 things that a person who is, for example, an educator should not do? Just like 3 things that you should never do as an educator who is, in contact with a disabled person.
I think sometimes the thing that people do that's not great is that they talk to the wheelchair or the parent. We're talking to the person. We also, as earlier speakers have said, we need to remember that we are a person first, and then we are a collection of characteristics after that. So we don't want to talk about a disability or even to say a SEND learner. What we mean is a person, and one of their characteristics is that they have a disability. And I think also not protect at the expense of supporting a young person to be able to access their adult life. It might be that for some young people, an independent sexual relationship might not happen for them. But we have to go into the conversation supporting the young person that it is their right to be sexual. And if they and their partner want to express that in a physical way, when they're old enough and they're ready and it feels right for them, then they have the right to. And that's the important starting point. Not to kind of protect at the expense of the person's rights.
Is there a thing, almost like a dream, that you would like to see in the future regarding the education for people with mental disability, for example?
There's a piece of research that MenCap in the UK carried out quite a long time ago now, about 15 years ago. And it showed that whereas the general population, approximately 70% people have sexual relationships and cohabit with their partner, amongst the community of people with disabilities, it was perhaps only as low as 3%. So for me, the dream there would be that percentage could be higher, because so many young people reported that the problem they were encountering was actually a lack of privacy and a lack of potential to even meet somebody. So if these kind of simple initiatives to support a young person to have independence, it will support them to access their sexual health, including the part of the sexual health definition about having pleasurable and safe experiences if that is what they want for themselves.
Thank you for this answer and thank you so much for the presentation. Nüüd lähme meie edasi, aga siit juba eesti keeles ja järgmiseks esinejaks on Rita Holm, kes tuleb rääkima meile sellest, mis toimub Eesti hooldekodudes ja tema kui koolitaja ja seksuaalkasvataja nägemus sellest, mis on hästi ja mis võiks olla parem. Nii et Rita, sõna on sinu.
Ma olen Rita Holm. Olen seksuaalkasvataja, seksuaalnõustaja ja ka koolitaja ja aktsiaselts hoolekandeteenuste palvel olen ma korraldanud koolitusi tegevusjuhendajatele augustis ja septembris 2021. aastal. Kokku on osalenud nende 2 kuu jooksul koolitustel 115 hoolekande tegevusjuhendajat üle kogu Eesti. Teemaks on olnud intellektipuudega inimeste seksuaalkasvatus. Sisuks on olnud siis nõuanded ja soovitused seksuaalkasvatuse läbiviimiseks puudega inimestele, kusjuures olen peatunud ka siis eraldi kerge puudega, keskmise puudega ja raske puudega inimeste seksuaalkasvatusel ja ka veidi autistide ja skisofreenikute seksuaalkasvatusel. Teises osas olen ma kasutanud raamatu seksuaalkasvatuses lihtsas keeles, kasutamise juhendit oleme läbi käinud. Raamat on soomlaste poolt välja antud ja eesti keeles andis selle välja ohvriabi. Ja raamat on väga heaks materjaliks intellektipuudega inimestega töötamisel. Ja kolmandas osas puudutasin ma eneserahuldamist. Koolituse sisu. Kõigepealt selgitasin mõisteid, mis on üldse seksuaalsus, et seksuaalsus ei ole seesama asi, mis on seks. Kõige lihtsamalt seletada seda on, et seksuaalsus on see, mida me oleme ja seks on see, mida me teeme ja et inimene on seksuaalne sünnist surmani. Seksuaalkasvatus, see tähendab arusaadavalt ja lihtsas keeles ja hea oleks, kui oleks veel personaalse lähenemisega ja et intellektipuudega inimeste puhul võetaks arvesse ka konkreetselt just selle inimese vajadusi. Lisaks on seal veel ka tundekasvatus, oskus ära tunda enda tundeid, oskus neid väljendada ja turvalisuse kasvatus, mis on eriti oluline, sellepärast et väga tihti just nimelt puuetega inimesi kasutatakse ära seksuaalselt. Ja nendele turvareeglite õpetamine, mis on täpselt samad turvareeglid, mis on lastele, täpselt samamoodi ujumistrikoo seadus, täpselt samamoodi ütle ei, mine ära, räägi turvalisele tuttavale inimesele. Hästi oluline on ka eneserahuldamine, sellepärast et kõikidel inimestel on õigus naudingule, ka intellektipuudega inimestel. Puudutasin ka seksi, millest kõigest seks koosneb, et seks ei ole ainult penetratsioon, seksi alla kuulub ka palju muud. Tähtis on ka isiklik hügieen. Ja see isiklik hügieen on ka oluline seksuaalelu juures. Ja samuti, millel tuleb peatuda kindlasti intellektipuudega inimestel on suhted, et nad oskaksid vahet teha, kes on su sõber, kes on su partner, kes on su hooldaja. Sest kõikidel inimestel, ka raske puudega inimestel, on täpselt samasugused seksuaalsed vajadused kui meil kõigil ja neid on õigus ellu viia meil kõigil, ka raske puudega inimestel. Ja nad on võimelised täpselt samamoodi naudingut tundma, kuigi nende areng on võib-olla aeglasem, aga see areng siiski toimub ja väga nad vajavad abi enda piiride äratundmisel ja teiste piiride austamisel. Minu keha on minu oma, kes võib sulle lähedale tulla ja kas ma ise võin kellegile väga lähedale minna ja teist puudutada. Kahjuks intellektipuudega inimestel on tihti madal enesehinnang ja vähene inimsuhete olemasolu tekitavad sotsiaalse saamatuse, et ka selles osas nad väga vajavad abi. Aktsiaselts hoolekandeteenused on väga positiivselt ja edumeelselt suhtunud inimeste seksuaalkasvatusse ja nad on tellinud koolitusi. Nad on huvitatud, et nende personal saaks seksuaalsuse alaseid teadmisi ja need, kes on koolitusel käinud, need on andnud ka positiivset tagasisidet, et nimelt seda koolitust on väga vaja. Ja hoolekandeteenused on sellega teinud ära juba väga tähtsa ja suure töö, et klientidele on hooldekodudes võimaldatud peaaegu kõikidele oma isiklik ruum ja see isikliku ruumi olemasolu annab võimaluse ka enda seksuaalsust ellu viia palju kergemini. Edasiseks hoolekandeteenustega oleme aktiivselt arutanud seda, et peaks viima läbi veel lisakoolitusi, oleks väga vajalik ka õppematerjalide väljaandmine ja jalgratast pole tõesti vaja uuesti leiutada, vaid tuleks ka arendada rahvusvahelist koostööd, sest paljud asjad on meie naabermaades juba paremini ja miks mitte nendelt eeskuju võtta. Koolitus on vajalik personalile, sest töötajatel on puudulikud teadmised seksuaalsusest üldse, seksuaalkasvatusest üldse, seatakse küsimuse alla isegi seksuaalkasvatuse vajadus ja töötajatel endil on puudulikud teadmised ka iseenese seksuaalsusest. Aga selleks, et aidata intellektipuudega inimestel ellu viia enda seksuaalsust ja anda neile edasi seksuaalsuse alaseid teadmisi, peaks töötaja olema sinasõber ka iseenda seksuaalsusega. Ja üks oluline asi on see, et ei tohiks suhtuda intellektipuudega inimesse nagu lapsesse. Nii tema areng kahjuks taandub ja lapseline käitumine tihti võimendub. Koolitusel ilmnes ka vastuseisusid. Öeldi, et eneserahuldamine on tabu, osa hooldekodudes öeldi, aga samas teised koolitusel käijad ütlesid, et kuidas nii, et eneserahuldamine ei ole ammu enam tabu. See on siiski nii, et kui ka sellega kodus keegi tegeleb, siis sellest rääkimine on endiselt tabu. Väideti ka, et ei, meil pole näiteks probleeme sellega, et miks peaks üldse kondoomi kasutamist õpetama, kui meil ei ole sellele järgi mingisugust vajadust. Aga kui me oleme öelnud hoolekandeasutuses klientidele, et eneserahuldamine ei ole hea, vahekord ei ole hea, siis tekibki olukord, et ei peagi neile mingisugust seksuaalharidust andma. Ja on väidetud ka, et meil pole vaja näiteks eneserahuldamise õpetust ja seda on üldse väga raske teha ja me ei hakka mingeid abivahendeid hankima ja nii et osadele on see tabu, samas teised mõtlevad väga edumeelselt ja on koolitusega väga rahul. Lihtsam ja turvalisem viis intellektipuudega inimesele enda seksuaalsuse elluviimiseks on eneserahuldamine ja kahjuks ma hooldekodudes kohtasin seda, et kui ma hakkasin sellest rääkima, siis kliendid ütlesid, et ei, see on paha, seda ei tohi teha. Tähtis on siiski neile rääkida, nendele loa andmine, et te võite oma kehaga tutvuda, te võite tegeleda eneserahuldamisega, see on täiesti heaks kiidetud, selleks on luba antud ja tuleks hankida selleks ka abivahendeid ja tuleks õpetada ka erinevaid tehnikaid. On ka ilmnenud koolituste aeg, millest on räägitud, on see, et kahjuks kui üks hooldekodu klient siirdub ühest hooldekodust teise, siis temaga koos saadetud dokumentatsioon sealt puudub kahjuks tihti see seksuaalsuse osa või on ta seal väga minimaalselt. Aga väga tähtis oleks näiteks, et seal oleks ära märgitud näiteks see, kui klienti on seksuaalselt väärkoheldud, näiteks lapsepõlves, see ju mõjutab tema kogu edaspidist elu ja võib-olla ta on ise väärkohelnud teisi või tal on mingisugune muu äärmuslik seksuaalkäitumise viis. Osadel hooldekodudes elavaid kliente, kui neid on hoolekandeteenustel 1700, sest osa neist on ka liitpuudega, antud juhul 223 ja kui on tegu ka füüsilise puudega, siis on väga tähtis, et nad saaksid kasutada abivahendeid, et neid abistataks seksiks ettevalmistamisel ja aidataks neil ka need abivahendid paigale panna. Ja näiteks just ühes hooldekodus meesterahvast aidati eneserahuldamise juures ja kui see aitaja tema juurde enam ei tulnud, siis kahjuks oli ta väga ärev, isegi agressiivne, aga see on täiesti arusaadav, sest tema elust jäi midagi olulist välja, mis tal siiamaani oli olnud ja mida ta vajas. Koolitust peaks andma kõikidele, mitte nii, et ainult üks inimene hooldekodust käib, vaid koolitus oleks oluline kõikidele hooldekodutöötajatele. Ja kui ma koolitasin kliente, siis ka kliendid olid väga koolitusest huvitatud, nad rääkisid oma kogemustest ja ainult tuleb arvesse võtta, et see koolitus ei kestaks väga pikalt. Ja tulevikunägemusest, mida mina näeksin ka, et seksuaalsusalane koolitus oleks osaks tegevusjuhendajate õppeprogrammi juba koolitusasutuses. Ja tähtis oleks, et saaks koolitatud ka kõik juba praegu töötavad tegevusjuhendajad ja tähtis oleks anda koolitusi ka klientidele. Tähtis samuti on abivahendite hankimine, on need siis dildod, vibraatorid, masturbaatorid. Tähtis oleks ka hankida dildo juba sellepärast, et õpetada klientidele, kuidas õigesti näiteks kondoomi peale panna. Muidugi rääkida tuleks ka suguhaigustest ja kõigest muust, mis sellega kaasneb. Ja tähtis oleks ka seksuaalsete alaste materjalide väljaandmine, näiteks raamat enese rahuldamise kohta, raamat abivahendite kohta. Meie Põhjamaa naabritel on sellist materjali olemas, tuleks leida vahendid nende raamatute tõlkimiseks ja nendest oleks palju abi kõikidele. Hooldekodudes oleks abi ka koolides, näiteks seksuaalkasvatuse läbiviimisel ja võib-olla isegi mitte ainult intellektipuudega inimestele, vaid ka kõikidele ja ka noortele. Ja tähtis oleks arendada igatepidi koostööd just teiste riikide vastavad alaspetsialistidega. Tänan.
Aitäh, Rita, selle ettekande eest. Võib-olla nüüd alustame seda küsimuste ja vastuste sessiooni küsimusega, et miks me siis ei liigu edasi, et ühtpidi me ju kõik teame, mis need probleemid on, me teame, mida on vaja. Kas see on tõesti ainult raha küsimus või näiteks sina koolitajana, mida sa näed, kus kohas on need kitsaskohad, miks me ei ole jõudnud klientide koolitamiseni, miks kõik spetsialistid võib-olla ei saa nii palju head praktilist kogemust või siis ka lihtsalt ka teoreetilist baasi, et nad saaksid ja oskaksid tegelikult antud teemat käsitleda?
Ma ei oska öelda, miks pärast see siiamaani, miks see on sellises seisus, et varem pole koolitatud, aga ma arvan, et üks asi, mida kindlasti tuleks muuta, on see, et kui valmistatakse ette tegevus neid, kuidas nad ongi nüüd, tegevusnõustajad või abistajad hooldekodud, siis valmistamisel see, et seal oleks see seksuaalkasvatuse osa tunduvalt suurem. Võib-olla seda mingil määral, ma ei tea, ma ei ole kursis praegu puudutatakse, aul on see väga vähene, sest koolituse tagasiside on selline, et koolitus on väga vajalik ja et inimesed on saanud väga palju teadmisi juurde. Ja just minu arust taastööd teiste riikidega, kus see asi on juba kaugemale arenenud, sest headest kogemustest tasub alati malli võtta.
Sina oled väga palju kokku puutunud antud teemaga just hooldekodudes koolitusi tehes, aga me ju kõik teame, et puuetega inimesed ja erivajadustega inimesed ei ela ainult mitte hooldekodudes, vaid tegelikult täpselt nii nagu me kõik, kas siis oma kodudes, korterites või kuidas iganes, siis kuidas nendeni tegelikult võiks info nende seksuaaltervise ja seksuaalsuse kohta Eestis jõuda? Ühtpidi me näeme seda, et meedias räägitakse palju sellest, et isegi nii-öelda põhimõtteline seksuaalharidus kas või koolis meile endile on puudulik, aga siis me tuleme tegelikult veel keerulisema teema juurde, ehk siis erivajadustega inimese seksuaaltervis. Et kuidas tegelikult jõuda siis üleüldises plaanis inimesteni?
No, ma usun, et ikkagi siin peaks ka kaasama meediat ja oleks vaja vastavat artikleid. Ma ise olen ühe artikli kirjutanud, aga ühest artiklist on nagu natukene vähe. Aga ma tean ka, et üks teleajakirjanik on veidi huvi tundnud selle teema vastu, et võib-olla edaspidi saaks ka mingi panna või näiteks oleks väga kasulik, soomlastel on olemas mingisuguseid dokumentaalfilme, saateid, mida võiks ju ka televisioonis jätta.
Aitäh sulle, Rita, nende vastuste eest ja selle ettekande eest ja palju edu sulle oma tegevustes koolitamise valdkonnas. Teiega, head kuulajad, näeme juba tegelikult pärast väikest energiapausi, sellepärast et 3. sessioon, mis rääkis erivajadustega inimestest ja nende seksuaaltervisest, haridusest, saab nüüd otsa. 15-20 minutit on nüüd pausi, aga kui te näiteks ei näinud selle sessiooni ettekandeid, siis ärge muretsege, või siis te ei näinud teiste ettekandeid sellepärast, et vaatasite midagi muud, siis Tai kodulehele ja terviseinfo.ee lehele tegelikult pärast konverentsi ka kõik igasugused videoklipid üles lähevad, nii et ilma te millestki ei jää. Aga nüüd mina juhatan teid sisse väiksele energiapausile ja siis loodetavasti naudite juba konverentsi järgmisi paralleelsessioone mõnuga edasi. Aitäh teile ja kõike head!